Good evening, afternoon, morning. I see people are tuning in from all over the place. So depending on where you are, it's great to see you. My name is Sydney Yeager. I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's program on the history of anti-Semitism, the Crusades. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions and join us in October for the opening of Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more about that on our website. Also, closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Suzanne Yeager, Nicholas Paul, Robert Chazan, and Paola Tartakoff. Suzanne is professor of English and Medieval Studies at Fordham University and was educated at Oxford University and the University of Toronto Centre for Medieval Studies. Her research focuses on social identity and community formation, including constructions of race and memory in medieval literature and history. Nicholas is currently Associate Professor of History and Director of Medieval Studies at Fordham University, where he teaches and directs graduate research on topics related to the Crusades and political culture in the medieval world. His first book, To Follow in Their Footsteps, The Crusades and Family Memory in the High Middle Ages, was awarded the John Nicholas Brown Prize from the Medieval Academy of America. Robert is S.H. and Helen R. Scheuer Professor of Jewish History in the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University. His books include God, Humanity, and History, The Hebrew First Crusade Narratives, The Jews of Medieval Western Christendom, and Reassessing Jewish Life in Medieval Europe. Paola is Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Rutgers University, where she is Chair of the Department of Jewish Studies. She's the author of 2 books about Jewish-Christian relations during the Middle Ages, Between Christian and Jew Conversion and Inquisition in the Medieval Crown of Aragon, and Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder in Medieval Europe. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And now I'm going to hand things off to Paola. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and good evening, everyone. It's such a privilege to be in conversation tonight with 3 experts in medieval history who bring such different and rich perspectives to our subject for this evening. So their research ranges geographically from Europe through the Near East, thematically from political history to the history of Jewish-Christian relations, to the history of memory and commemoration and the constructions of group identities and narratives, and chronologically from the 11th through the 14th centuries. So we're in for a real treat as together these 3 historians are going to bring us more deeply into the history of anti-Semitism and into Jewish history and the history of Jewish-Christian relations. So I'm sure that everyone in the audience has heard of the Crusades, but I also know that there are a lot of misconceptions about what the Crusades actually were. So I thought perhaps we could begin with asking Professor Paul to explain what the Crusades were and where Jews found themselves geographically and otherwise during the Crusades.
Thank you, Professor Tartakoff. Am I on audio? Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. I think that in the popular understanding of the Crusades, when we think about how the Crusades are portrayed in books and movies, and especially in video games, it seems like many people today see the Crusades as a conflict that happened in the Middle Ages between Christians and Muslims, and usually waged in the Holy Land or around the city of Jerusalem. And I think it's important to say that because in the mainstream depiction of the Crusades, this may not be true for this audience, but in the mainstream depiction of the Crusades, we don't see very much that would emphasize the place of the Crusades in relation to the history of anti-Semitism. So let's start off by just saying, well, what were the Crusades? How do historians, medieval historians like us on this panel today understand the Crusades? We understand the Crusades to have been a very particular form of medieval Western Latin Christian or Catholic Christian form of holy war, which combined the readiness to do violence and the dangers of war on the one hand, with the reward of penitential devotional practices like pilgrimage that was good for the soul on the other. An individual Christian who took up the cross, the symbol of their obligation to undertake onerous responsibilities of penance, they took up the cross, and when they were wearing that symbol, they changed their status to that of a crusader, which eventually became like a quasi-legal category. Formally, in order for this transformation to take place, the rituals and symbols, the invitation to go on a crusade came from official representatives of the Roman Church. Informally, however, the status of the crusader was also seized upon by a range of groups who were not sanctioned by the church and not in communication at all with ecclesiastical officials about any kind of crusading project or plan. And we often see that informal kind of crusading in the context of popular movements and uprisings. So crusading was also much larger in scope and in chronological duration than is usually appreciated. Although the First Crusade, which was first announced by Pope Urban II in November 1095, was directed toward Jerusalem, in fact, crusading wars were waged on many, many fronts and across a wide variety of targets, including Muslims in Spain and Portugal, the pagan peoples of the Baltic, Orthodox Greek-speaking Christians in the Byzantine Empire, the population of the Canary Islands, and against many enemies who were also themselves Latin Christian Roman Catholics. So notice that there's one group who was not the formal target of an officially sanctioned crusade preaching expedition, and that is to say Jews. Now, many groups could become the subject of crusading violence who were not formally the target of crusade preaching, but the implications of crusading for Jewish communities in particular is really quite distinctive. In the first place, that's because of the violence itself. In the 12th century, for example, the departure of every one of the major crusade expeditions was accompanied by widespread anti-Jewish violence. We find that from the very beginning with the departure of the First Crusade, acts of tremendous violence were committed against Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Then again, both in Germany, England, and northern France with the gathering of the Second Crusade in 1146 and 1147. And again, at the time of the preaching of the Third Crusade, most dramatically in England in 1190. In the 13th century, when ecclesiastical control over crusading became more robust, the phenomenon of the popular crusade, not licensed by the church, also returns. And with it, nearly every time we find massacres of Jewish communities. So 1251, 1309, 1320, one could keep going. We might mention in particular 1492, the year that the Catholic monarchy of Castile and Aragon conquered the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, only 3 months later, calling for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So just as important as this narrative of massacres and forced conversions and expulsions are spiritual and ideological developments that went along with crusading. Taking up the cross as a crusader was obviously an act that closely associated the individual Christian with the suffering and death of Jesus at the hands, medieval Latin Christians believed, of Jews. Increased meditation on the idea that the result of crucifixion was not only redemptive suffering, but actually redemptive violence, doubtless played a role in the violent turn toward Jews in the wake of crusade preaching. Perhaps the most widely disseminated history of the First Crusade was not a Latin chronicle, but an old French epic song, the Song of Antioch, copied in dozens of manuscripts traditions for centuries. And it begins its story with Demas, the good thief, crucified beside Jesus, asking him, "Who shall have revenge upon the Jews for his crucifixion?" And Jesus responds by prophesying the coming of the First Crusade, formally associating the two ideas in this widespread, very popular piece of medieval literature. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you, Professor Paul. That was such a rich introduction, and there's so much to go into and to delve into more deeply. So you mentioned 1096 and the start of the First Crusade, and this is a notorious moment in the deep history of what is now called anti-Semitism. And I would love to invite Professor Chazan to help us take a closer look at what exactly happens to Jews, for example, in the Rhineland in 1096, and how we can understand those developments in light of the state of Jewish-Christian relations at that time.
Great. The first thing that I would want to emphasize is by the time we get down to the 11th century, long prior to that, the church had developed a very clear-cut stance for Christians toward Jews. And the stance involved assurance of safety for Jews. Jews were not to be persecuted, were not to be physically attacked, were not to be physically brought into the church. Jewish institutions were protected. One couldn't go into a church and start destroying it. I'm sorry, one couldn't go into a synagogue and start destroying it. And when the police come and ask you what you're doing, you say, well, these are Jews and we're empowered to do this. In fact, we're encouraged to do this. The real reality of church doctrine was that Christians were forbidden from violating synagogues, Jewish cemeteries, whatever. In this sense, the Crusades assume a certain kind of importance. They represent the first legitimation, as it were, of Christian anti-Jewish violence. And while the First Crusade was called for and organized by Pope Urban II, he made it clear what the issue was. And it had nothing to do with Jews. It had to do with Muslims who were attacking Jewish pilgrims to the Holy Land. And so the objective of the crusade, let me add an adjective, the limited objective of the crusade was to save Christian pilgrims from the threat of Muslim violence. Where do Jews fit into this? The answer is simple: nowhere. Jews played no role in anti-Christian violence. Jews were not part of the preaching of the First Crusade, the formal preaching of the First Crusade. But one of the lessons, one of the very broad lessons of crusading is that once violence is launched, it's very difficult to control it. And in effect, what happens is there are a few formal church crusading bands where the leadership knows and enforces church doctrine. But then there are all kinds of spin-off crusading groups, some led by, let me call them rogue churchmen, people who were churchmen, but were not deeply immersed in church doctrine vis-a-vis the Jews. And then there were baronial crusading bands, which often had their own personal objectives, namely carving out territories in the Near East, and a lot of such territories were carved out. And then broader objectives. Our knowledge of the First Crusade is due in part to some fairly full Christian Latin accounts, but more important yet and fuller yet are some Hebrew narratives. They're very unusual. And what they describe in great detail is the grounds for assaulting Jews and the heroic Jewish responses, which really create a sense of Jewish martyrs. The grounds portrayed in these Hebrew documents, and again, I want to emphasize, they are not traditional church views. Basically, the sense is, you know what? The Crusades represented Christendom's attack on Muslims, which it actually did not. It was a much more narrowly defined Christian attack on violent Muslim groups, but it sort of elides into attack on Muslims, and then on that, these popular bands added a very interesting, it's called in Hebrew a kal vachomer, an argument if A is true, given the relationship of A and B, then B is certainly true. And the claim is this is war against the Muslims because they don't believe in Jesus. And that's not what the crusade formally was, but it shows popular perception / distortion. And then on that is this kal vachomer. If crusading sanctions attacks on Muslims because they don't believe in Jesus, then kal vachomer, or in traditional Jewish legal thinking, alachat kama v'chama, all the more so do these organized Christian efforts involve attack on Jews, because not only do Jews not believe in Jesus, but they were responsible for his crucifixion. It is a kind of warning siren for the future about the deleterious impact among Christians of the gospel record of Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion. It's the first time we see it in practice, and subsequent episodes of anti-Semitism show repeatedly the impact of this core Christian image of Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Professor Chazan, could you say a bit more about the acts of martyrdom that you mentioned and how those are to be understood and how they're described in the Hebrew Chronicles?
Good. I'm happy to do so. The first thing is they're described in great detail and in rich and emotionally evocative terms. you see people ordered to become Christians, refusing to do so, learning what the results of that refusal is going to be in terms of physical suffering and acceptance of that physical suffering. What I think this indicates is that medieval Western Christendom, which during the 11th century was coming to the fore, it had been the weakest of the religio-political units, weaker than the Byzantine Empire, a lot weaker than the Muslim areas. It was now moving to the fore. Northern Europe was changing in a lot of strongly positive ways. Military strength was emerging, economic strength was emerging, a set of very powerful states, England, France, the various German baronies, were moving to the forefront of Western political and military power. Now, that growing power of Western Christendom continues to intensify through the Middle Ages, so that by the time we get the end of the Middle Ages, what had been the weakest area in the Western world was now the strongest. Western Christendom, as we all know, led the way in exploration and in proselytizing the newly explored areas. Again, in theory, this shouldn't have had major implications for the Jews, but it did in two ways. Number one, because of Jewish mobility, and that's a reality all through the ages, as Western Christendom becomes economically more powerful and economically more appealing, Jews move. And the Jewish population of Western Christendom grows. That's a very, very important development. And then, in addition, some of the negative imagery of Jews in the Gospels come to play a role in emerging negative imagery of the Jews. And I'm going to say one more thing about that, because you asked about the nature of these chronicles. They are so much influenced by Christian martyrdom as a core issue in Christianity. And it indicates the way in which, over the ages, Jews have regularly been influenced by the environment in which they live. And the Jews who are doing these acts of martyrdom aren't stopping and say, hey, wait a second. My great-great-great-great-grandparent rabbis didn't do this kind of thing. Maybe I'm just copying what. No, that's what religiosity is in this area. And the result is unique Jewish historical writings.
Thank you, Professor Chazan. So I'd love to discuss this further, and maybe we'll have more opportunities, especially during the Q&A. But I would also like to turn now to the question of memory and how both Christians and Jews are going to remember the Crusades during the subsequent decades and centuries. So, Professor Yeager, how did medieval Christians write about the Crusades in retrospect, and what roles did Jews play in those rememberings?
Thanks, Professor Tartakoff. There were so many ways that they did do this. There were many ways that medieval Christians constructed an identity for Jews in the medieval period. These were not consistent and varied from group to group and were contradictory, even within a single Christian text itself. There seems a pattern of socio-political elites using Jews to diffuse social tensions, and this would even predate Christianity. You can see it in the Hellenistic world. But for medieval Christians, especially Christians living in Europe between 500 and 1500 CE, there was a dichotomous view, and Professors Paul and Chazan have spoken to this. But this view would, one view would venerate and hold Jews sacred because of their place in Scripture. The divine had honored Jews as the chosen people. Jews were also esteemed by medieval Christians as the lineage of Jesus Christ. And as Professor Chazan said, this view of special status later developed into a formal doctrine influenced by St. Augustine that set Jews aside for special protection. They were perceived as witnesses to the Christian faith, part of that Christian narrative. And the other view by the 4th century came to see Jews as part of a Christian vengeance narrative. Jews were to be despised for their position in the Christian Gospels. Jews were perceived as, implicated in the killing of Christ, and therefore all kinds of negative stereotypes grew up around a desire to view Jews as depraved. Medieval stereotypes were that Jews were diabolical, that Jews committed blood libel. And these were stereotypes that intended to make Jews monstrous and therefore deserving of punishment. And I know, Professor Tartakoff, you researched that extensively. But when we look at Jewish, look at the Crusade histories as told by Christian and Jewish writers alike, we see a discourse of vengeance coming from Christians. Some Crusaders believed that their killing a Muslim inhabitant of the Holy Land would earn them divine reward. What we see in the First Crusade Chronicles is an extension of that logic, a belief that some Christians held that slaying Jews as an act of crusading vengeance would likely earn these Christians a place in heaven. So of the medieval texts that show this view of Judaism, one of the most important, I think, is an anonymous poem called The Siege of Jerusalem, written in Middle English in the 14th century, which had earlier Latin versions that circulated all over Europe, and which drew loosely from Josephus' 1st century account of the Roman siege of the Holy City. What the siege poem did was to invite Christian audiences to imagine themselves taking part in the Roman siege of Jerusalem, making it seem like besieging Jerusalem was a Christian tradition. So that sort of ties into this idea of memory and memorializing. But a few more things to say about it. The poem is a horrifying revisionist history. Roman generals Titus and Vespasian convert to Christianity. And we know that the Roman Empire wouldn't convert until the 4th century, but there you go, that we're reinventing history here. Then these same generals set out to seize Jerusalem in order to avenge Christ. Jerusalem is besieged. The Jewish inhabitants are starving. Christian soldiers brutally murder Caiaphas and his high priests. Titus and Vespasian offer to end the siege if Jews will convert to Christianity. So you can see pieces of the other First Crusade narratives threading through here, right? So Jews refuse and are called blind, called obstinate. So recalling Josephus' account in the Book of Lamentations, a starving Jewish mother roasts and eats her child. The temple treasures are packed up by Romans, Jews are enslaved, and the Romans go away singing. But what's important to take away from the poem is to see it as an example of anti-Judaism that supported bloody crusades. The anachronistic involvement of Christians at the Roman siege was copied elsewhere in medieval Christian art, devotional books, dramatic performance. It was meant to persuade its audiences to participate in the Crusades, whether as fighters, financial underwriters, or as spiritual supporters, where Christians could imagine a crusade of the soul. And these Christians memorialized the fall of the Second Temple to create a precedent for the Crusades.
Thank you so much, Professor Yeager. So at the same time as Christians are remembering the Crusades in these complex ways, we know that Jews are still reeling from the impact of the massacres of 1096 and subsequently from the impact of additional violence associated with crusading. Professor Chazan, can you share briefly some of the ways that Jews are going to memorialize the events of 1096 and perhaps how that memory is seen shaping sense of Jewish identity in medieval Christendom?
There's a lot of synagogue poetry that's written in memory of the martyrs. Again, this is transforming the victims of crusading violence with a sense that the victims had a measure of choice. If they wanted to save themselves physical suffering, they could convert, and who would know what would happen afterwards? But they rejected this option and instead accepted painful death, I'm going to say in much the same way as the great Christian martyrs of early Christianity accepted death at the hands of Romans and became beatified as saintly martyrs. Let me just add a quick jump to the present, and then I'll pull back from it. Many serious church thinkers of the late 20th and 21st century have come to acknowledge the enormous impact that the gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus exerted. The gospel sources are written to indicate that there was not a serious conflict between Jesus and the Romans. The conflict was with the Jews, and the Jews, out of their internal Jewish religious concerns, opted, they couldn't crucify Jesus physically because Rome ruled, but they opted to, let me use an odd modern term, to propagandize in such a way as the Romans would be moved toward crucifixion. Crucifixion, it's hard to realize this because it has such a role subsequently in Christianity, but crucifixion was a Roman punishment. And the claim, the implicit claim in the Gospels was the Romans really didn't want to do it. It is a Roman punishment, and Roman soldiers put Jesus up on the cross. not Jews.
Thank you,
But
Professor Chazan.
the Roman behaviors were the result of Jewish propaganda, effective Jewish propaganda.
So we're seeing how complicated this is and how intertwined the stories and the realities and the behaviors are, and how much mutual influence and transgenerational beliefs and processes are involved in creating what happens during the Crusades, and also the ways that different communities are responding to and trying to make sense of the violence that happens during the Crusades. Professor Paul, in your research that has taken a broader geographic lens, have you come across additional types of Jewish responses to these events in subsequent decades? I'm thinking of the ways that these responses might go beyond the composition of, for example, liturgical texts and poems that commemorate the deaths of martyrs.
Thank you. Yes, and these responses that we've been talking about, and the commemoration of crusading violence and between communities is obviously extraordinarily important, and the history of the Crusades and the Jewish communities in Europe is extraordinarily important. But I think it can be useful just to, as a reminder of a kind of larger framework, larger frame of reference. If we step away from this for a second and think of the Crusades not only in terms of ideology, and not only in terms of the events that accompanied their beginning, but instead in terms of, you know, their implications, that what happened, right? The larger series of military conquests that resulted from crusading. We are reminded of this, that crusading was responsible for this dramatic expansion of territory controlled by Latin Christian Europeans, and that in some of the regions most closely associated with crusading, the fate of Jewish communities was quite different than it was in Western Europe, where the Crusades began. So the First Crusade, where we've talked already about these massacres that accompanied the First Crusade and the martyrdoms, well, that expedition ended with the establishment of a series of principalities in the Eastern Mediterranean that existed within the modern states of Israel, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Cyprus, Crete, and that lasted there for 2 to 3 centuries. They were ruled by a French-speaking Latin Christian aristocracy. These states had Latin Christian European overlords who we usually call them the Franks. They call, you know, this was a term that's usually used to refer to them. And when they created these principalities, now the creation of the principalities was also an act of tremendous violence and resulted in massacres of populations, in particular in the city of Jerusalem itself. But once these states had been established, the rulers, the Frankish rulers of them, essentially adopted many of the systems of governance that had been there previously under the Muslim rulers who held those lands, including the dhimmi status of protected minority groups within their lands. And that encompassed the Jews who lived in those territories. So the status of the Jews who lived under crusading lords in the Eastern Mediterranean was in fact quite different than the status of Jews in medieval Europe. In many cases, it seems that many of those communities, once they had survived the initial conquests and sort of reconstituted themselves, were in fact able to thrive in this Eastern Mediterranean context. And in part, that's because the Franks, in order to capitalize on what they had conquered, were keen to restore business as usual, obviously in the port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, restore trade networks, establish long-standing systems that were there. But also because the Crusader states were incredibly weak, and they were never able to exercise particularly strong centralized authority, which created an opportunity for groups who wanted to sort of negotiate with the rulers for status. And so by the 13th century, you find in these Crusader states, as we call them, legal regulations which afford to Jews to subject Eastern Christian populations and to Muslim populations a rather high degree of independence from the Frankish population. And I think that's something that's quite important to remember. It's also worth noting that these communities produced some of the most remarkable intellectual, theological works of the Middle Ages. This is the world of Moses Maimonides, moved around this world conquered by crusading Franks and his successors. And in fact, it was the case that in the early 13th century, the Crusader states saw an influx and immigration of Jews from medieval Europe who departed from Northern Europe and actually moved to the capital of the Crusader kingdom at that time of Akko or Acre. So that's something important, I think, for us to think about when we think about the sort of global picture of crusading and anti-Semitism more generally, that there are many stories that are unfolding under that umbrella.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And how that relates to Jewish and Christian understandings of pilgrimage and of the meanings of Jerusalem and of making pilgrimage specifically to Jerusalem. Absolutely fascinating. We could go on for a very long time. So much of what we've covered this evening is profoundly sobering, and the time has been flying for me. I can't believe what time it is already, but I would love to come to a close. We still have some time this evening together by reflecting a little bit on how understanding these points in the past, which are often quite dark, how better understanding them might help us forge a better future. What can we learn from better understanding these episodes in the deep history of what we can call anti-Semitism? Professor Yeager, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Certainly. I think my own thoughts, and definitely what we're putting together tonight, all of us scholars who are putting together tonight, is a sense of the deep breadth of experience, and to sort of understand, the variety of experience that was available, but also the importance of looking at a history of anti-Semitism that goes very much further back, I think, than maybe most people are aware. And so I think, from my point of view, one of the best ways to continue to work, against processes of anti-Semitism is to, continue, with a mission of like what the museum is doing with education, with continuing to teach our students about the expulsions that happen, about the false accusations of Jewish blood libel, and to do our best to remedy this many distortions of the past.
Thank you so much, Professor Yeager. Professor Paul.
I would just have two things to say to that. The first is to just remember that all of these histories are connected, right? In the past, these communities are part of one story, and to try and always remember that it's one story and to think of it that way and tell it that way, that we're talking about the history of people who all shared this world, lived together, and not as the history of sort of distinct, siloed, separate groups. I think it should always be considered as a whole, holistically. And then the second thing that I would say is just to remember that rhetoric and polemic are incredibly dangerous, and that they can be activated by events that are sometimes cannot be anticipated. And so confronting rhetoric of hate and polemic when you see it is extremely important, because if it's not confronted, you never know where it's going to show up and what it's capable of under different circumstances.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Professor Chazan.
The history of anti-Semitism takes place in a lot of different environments with different underlying patterns of thought and social action. I think one of the things that's called for is sophisticated work. And the term anti-Semitism is problematic because it comes very late. If you had said to Maimonides or Rabbeinu Gershom, what do you think about anti-Semitism? Even if you said it in Hebrew, they'd have no idea of what you're talking about. It's a term that reflects, let me call it, the secularization of anti-Jewish sentiment that took place in the 19th and 20th century. So I'm a little queasy about using the term, but the study of anti-Jewish thinking and behavior over a long period of time, to be aware of cultural idiosyncrasies reflected in the various periods. There's a sense that anti-Semitism is continuous, that Jews have constantly been the object of hatred. I find myself somewhat queasy with that. Jews as a minority community have been subjected to dangerous negative thinking and serious negative actions in a lot of different ways. And I think it's important to understand the difficult periods in their uniqueness, but then to see if it's not possible to elicit some parallels. And one of them, I think, that's emerged during this conversation is the tremendous impact of the gospel imageries of the Jews as calling for the crucifixion of Jesus. It stimulates in so many different periods outbreaks, serious outbreaks of anti-Jewish thinking and anti-Jewish behavior.
Thank you, Professor Chazan. So much to be aware of, and so much that understanding the past better can help us be more sensitive to in the world around us, and prod us, as Professor Paul said, to respond to what we hear, what we read, to speak up. And even more broadly than the fateful power of these passion narratives, even more broadly, the power of stories, right? As we heard also from Professor Yeager about the ways that the Crusades are narrativized and re-experienced vicariously by later generations, and how powerful that is for people who are participating in those readings or reenactments, and how the past lives on in those ways and has dangerous power, but also has this, thankfully, this potential to educate us in ways that can help us see how things could have been different and can still be different. So we have some great questions in the Q&A. One is very short for Professor Yeager. Could you please repeat the name of the poem that you referenced?
Certainly. It's a poem called The Siege of Jerusalem. And you can get it in a modern English translation by Adrian Williams Boyarin. But there are other Middle English versions as well.
Great. Thank you, Professor Yeager. So we have a question about how the church has responded to the Crusades, especially nowadays. How does the church view the Crusades? Have they ever addressed the anti-Semitic and Islamophobic violence that occurred at that time? And I would just piggyback on that question, if I might, and ask whether, and I know that the answer is to some extent yes, but maybe we could briefly mention some of the ways that some churchmen did speak out during the Middle Ages against the anti-Jewish violence that became part of the history of the Crusades. So I guess this is a broader question that perhaps that any of you or all three of you might want to speak to about Christian condemnations of anti-Jewish violence and anti-Muslim violence in the context of crusading in the past and in the present.
I thought this might happen. This issue might happen. The great church figure behind the Second Crusade was a churchman named Bernard of Clairvaux, French. He wrote a lot of letters calling for a new crusade and explaining the circumstances. But all these letters in their various formulations include a paragraph about the Jews. Let me read a little bit of it. Moreover, I warn you, brethren, indeed not only I, but the apostle of God along with me, not to believe every spirit. We have heard with great joy that the zeal of God burns in you, but it is necessary in all things that the restraint of knowledge not be absent. I mean, this is striking language. The Jews are not to be persecuted, killed, or even put to flight. Ask those who know the sacred scriptures what prophecy is found in the psalm concerning the Jews. God says the church will show me victory over my foes. Do not kill them, lest my people be unmindful.
Thank
And
you,
what he advances is a notion religiously. It's not a very positive image, but religiously, the dispersion of the Jews and their minority status everywhere makes them kind of testimony to the truth of Christianity. They must not be persecuted, killed, or even put to flight. And I would say in the contemporary church, where there are all kinds of churchmen, some of them have undertaken a study of the impact. Let me be clear and say it aloud, the negative impact of the gospel narratives on subsequent forms of anti-Jewish thinking and behavior, even when those forms are rigorously, seemingly secular.
Professor Yeager, Professor Paul, did you want to jump in on this question as well? Yes.
I can just say that if you're looking for very specific examples of reflection on these events, Pope John Paul II issued a series of major kind of apologies, apologetic letters, apologetic sermons, which specifically raised violence against the Jews in the context of the Crusades. So that was acknowledged. It actually sparked a really interesting conversation, which is very relevant to this forum, because what followed was the question of why the apology hadn't covered everything up to and including the Holocaust. But it was very much actually focused on medieval and early modern events, I think, if I remember it correctly. And there was a lot of conversation. He actually went to Greece to issue a joint declaration with the Patriarch about apologizing for the Fourth Crusade and violence against Orthodox Christians. But there were specific apologies that mentioned violence against Jews in the context of the Crusades as well.
Professor Yeager, did you want to? Yes.
Yes, there's Pope John Paul's actions. I was thinking about going back in history and thinking about people like William of Newburgh, Augustinian historian who in the 14th century was saying a lot of similar things, the tenor of Bernard of Clairvaux that Professor Chazan raised as well, going so far as to suggest a kind of allyship, that Christians look at Jewish communities and the way that they have handled, threat and unrest, and perhaps draw some sort of devotional inspiration from that, for their own kind of spirituality.
So we see a I don't know if it's continuous, but a thread that goes back deep in history of Christians who are objecting to and who are concerned about what they know is going on at times in terms of anti-Jewish violence inflicted by Christians. And of course, at the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, we have the document Nostra Aetate that is going to rescind once and for all the charge of deicide, the sense that all Jews everywhere, are guilty for the crucifixion of Christ. And Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was involved in some of the conversations that led to the promulgation of Nostra Aetate. So that's a fascinating piece of modern history. Just one question more to close. This question is about the Hebrew Chronicles describing the Crusades. Who wrote them? How many are there? And are they available in English?
There aren't a lot of them. They've been issued in a couple of critical editions. There is an English collection. I'm blocking on the name of the editor and author. And I apologize for that. But I think if you look under like Hebrew Crusade Chronicles in English translation, you'll find a very good collection. And even in English translation, not all the inherent power of the original Hebrew is lost. It carries through.
Lomo Eidelberg is the editor.
Yes.
I believe. Yes.
Yes, he is. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sydney. I think we're going to turn this over to you now. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I'm sure that it's going to continue generating more questions and more conversation.
Yeah, I want to thank all four of you for this really amazing conversation. I learned so much, and Paola, I want to thank you especially for moderating today and for really leading us through this topic. But to all of you, I really appreciate you being here with us and taking the time. And to all of you who joined us today, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we hope you'll join us for future programs, and also consider making a donation to the museum, which you can do at the links that I put in the chat. We also hope that you will join us for our discussion next week of the book Hamlet's Children with Richard Kluger and Juliana Margulies on October 5th, and our screening of the film Dear Freddy on Tuesday, October 10th. You can watch past programs and view and share today's recording, which is going to be available next week on the museum's YouTube channel. Again, I want to thank all four of you. This really has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you again to everyone who joined us out there in the internetverse as well. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.